The cylinder began to turn before Ruth Hale understood whose voice was trapped inside it. It was black wax, no longer than her hand, and a pale crack ran from one rim toward the center like lightning across a winter window. On the little stage of the Briar Glen Opera House, the new phonograph shone beneath the gaslights. Behind it hung a mourning portrait of Abigail Mercer, the woman whose newspaper had decided for 30 years which births deserved a notice, which weddings deserved a column, and which disgraces deserved silence. The first sound was only a scratch. Then came the thin music of a piano, far away but unmistakable. Ruth felt the blood leave her face. She had heard that tune only once in 18 years. Beside the machine, Thomas Mercer bent to adjust the reproducer. He had returned from Chicago that morning to conduct his mother's memorial, and he had not yet seen Ruth in the fourth row. His hair had silver at the temples now. His hands were broader. But when he listened, he tilted his head exactly as he had at 29. The cylinder gave a sudden, wounded click. Then a young woman's voice sang one clear line. It was Ruth's voice. Thomas raised his head. The ladies of the memorial committee turned in their chairs. Ruth's daughter Nell, seated beside her, went still. Before the next line could sound, the crack caught beneath the needle. The cylinder jumped, shrieked, and split cleanly in two. For 1 second, nobody moved. Then Thomas looked across the rows of red plush seats and found Ruth. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked as if the dead had reached through the machine and placed a hand around his heart. 18 years earlier, Ruth had left Briar Glen carrying a carpet bag, a packet of violet seeds, and a child no one but Abigail Mercer knew was coming. Now the voice that might have told the truth lay broken on a square of green felt. The rehearsal ended at once. Mrs. Peabody, who presided over the Ladies' Library Association and believed every disaster improved when assigned to a committee, ordered the stage curtains closed. She urged everyone to remain calm, though no one had shown any intention of doing otherwise. In Briar Glen, people rarely shouted when shocked. They became useful. 2 ladies collected the printed programs. The church organist covered the phonograph with its velvet hood. Augusta Mercer, Thomas's widowed sister, stood beneath their mother's portrait with both hands locked around the silver handle of her walking stick. Only Nell ignored the sudden industry. She leaned close to Ruth and asked, very softly, whether the voice had truly been hers. Ruth could not make herself lie, not while the broken cylinder remained on the stage and Thomas stood over it. She said it had been hers a long time ago. Nell studied her face. At 16, she had the grave patience of someone accustomed to receiving half an answer and waiting until the other half grew too heavy to carry. Her hair was brown, not black like Ruth's. Her eyes were gray with a ring of amber close to the pupil. All her life, people had said those eyes must have belonged to the father she had never known. Ruth had always answered that they came from her mother's side. That was true. It was simply not Ruth's mother she meant. On stage, Thomas wrapped each piece of the cylinder in cotton. He moved slowly with the care of a surgeon lifting bone from an open wound. He had become known in Chicago for improving sound boxes and recording mechanisms. The newspapers called his company one of the modest marvels of the new century. Ruth had seen his name in print and trained herself not to pause over it. Now Augusta spoke to him in a low, urgent voice. Thomas listened without looking at her. Then he placed the cotton-wrapped pieces into a wooden case and closed the lid. Ruth touched Nell's sleeve. They could leave through the side aisle before anyone stopped them. They had almost reached the lobby when Thomas called her name. Not Miss Hale, not Mrs. Hale, which the town had politely called her since she returned with an infant and no husband. He said Ruth. The name traveled through the emptying opera house. It seemed to wake dust in the chandeliers. Nell's hand slipped into hers. Ruth turned. Thomas came down the aisle holding the wooden case. At close range, time showed itself in small, unkind details. There were hollows beneath his cheekbones and a pale line beside his mouth. He wore an excellent black suit, but one cuff had been fastened through the wrong buttonhole. His mother's death had done what years of business travel had not, made him careless in public. He said that he had not known the cylinder existed until it was found 3 days ago in a locked cabinet at the newspaper office. His mother's secretary had discovered it behind bundles of old printing proofs. The paper label bore the words June Festival, 1891, and the initials R.H. Ruth said nothing. He asked if she knew what else had been recorded. She looked at the case rather than his face. She knew what had happened that afternoon behind the velvet scenery of the old exhibition hall. She knew what Abigail had said. She knew what she herself had answered while believing the machine in the next room had stopped. But she did not know how much the wax had caught. She told Thomas that some things survived by accident, and others survived because somebody was too frightened to destroy them. Augusta reached them before he could answer. She wore full mourning, though Abigail had died 6 weeks ago, and the black crepe around her hat made her narrow face appear to float in shadow. She greeted Ruth with the distant courtesy reserved for a tradeswoman who might be asked to deliver flowers to the back entrance. Ruth grew flowers for a living. She had spent 20 years accepting that tone from women who wanted her roses open at precisely the right hour for a wedding, and her lilies closed at precisely the right hour for a funeral. Courtesy could be another kind of locked door. Ruth had learned not to bruise her hands against it. Augusta said the recording belonged to the Mercer estate and would be examined privately. The memorial rehearsal had been unfortunate. There was no reason to involve Miss Hale or the girl. The girl. Nell's fingers tightened around Ruth's. Thomas looked at Nell then. He had glanced at her during the music, but now he saw her. His attention settled first on her face, then on her eyes, and something uncertain moved across his own. Ruth stepped half a pace in front of her daughter. She told Augusta that she had not asked to be involved. Mrs. Peabody had ordered 6 pots of white cyclamen for the memorial, and Ruth had come to make certain the heat from the footlights would not wilt them. If the Mercers did not want the town hearing voices from their cabinet, they should be more cautious about what they placed on a public stage. Augusta's mouth sharpened. Thomas did not defend his sister, but neither did he look away from Nell. He asked her name. Nell answered for herself, Eleanor Hale, though everyone called her Nell. The name seemed to strike him more quietly than the voice from the phonograph. He repeated Eleanor as if testing the weight of it. Ruth told Nell it was time to go. Outside, late February had turned the street to gray slush. A trolley bell sounded at the corner. Across Cedar Avenue, the windows of the Mercer Gazette still carried black borders for Abigail. Above the entrance, a fresh placard announced that the memorial would celebrate a life of moral courage and civic devotion. Ruth could feel Thomas watching from the opera house doors as she and Nell walked away. She did not look back. Their greenhouse stood at the southern edge of town, where the brick shops gave way to frame houses and then to open fields. Its glass roof had been patched so many times that no 2 panes held the same shade of sky. In the workroom, damp heat embraced them. The familiar sense of soil, geranium leaves, coal smoke, and wet raffia closed around Ruth like hands. Nell removed her hat and hung it beside the stove. She did not ask about Thomas. She helped carry the cyclamen back to the long bench, checked the dampness of the seed trays, and trimmed the blackened edge from a fern. Her silence was not forgiveness. It was preparation. Ruth busied herself with the afternoon orders. 6 red carnations for a hotel guest. A bowl of forced narcissus for the doctor's wife. A spray of smilax to be wired around a portrait frame at the Methodist church. She wrote each item on a slate, erased it after it was finished, and wished memory could be managed the same way. At dusk, Nell set 2 bowls of potato soup on the work table between packets of seed. Only then did she ask how Ruth had known Thomas Mercer. Ruth said they had grown up in the same town. Nell waited. Ruth added that Thomas's father had bought flowers from Ruth's father when there was still a Hale nursery on the river road. Nell waited again. The greenhouse glass ticked as the temperature fell outside. In one corner, drops of condensation gathered and ran down the panes. Ruth watched one reach the wooden sill. She said she and Thomas had once planned to marry. Nell lowered her spoon. Ruth had imagined this confession in 100 forms. In some, Nell wept. In others, she accused. Sometimes she laughed at Ruth's foolishness and the moment became survivable. Ruth had never imagined the calm, almost adult sorrow that entered her daughter's face. Nell asked whether he had been the man in the small photograph hidden beneath the linen in Ruth's trunk. Ruth looked at her. The photograph had been taken at the June Festival in 1891. Thomas stood beside the recording machine in shirt sleeves, smiling at something outside the frame. Ruth had believed she had burned it in Chicago before Nell was born. Nell explained that she had found it the previous autumn while searching for the blue wool blanket. She had not asked because Ruth had been ill with influenza, and afterward the right moment never seemed to arrive. Children, Ruth thought, were often accused of carelessness by adults who depended upon their tact. She admitted that it was Thomas. Nell asked why they had not married. Ruth folded a square of newspaper around a carnation stem that did not need wrapping. She said his mother had opposed it. Abigail believed a Mercer should marry a family with influence, not the daughter of a nursery owner whose land was mortgaged and whose mother had been born in a Welsh mining village. Thomas had promised that his mother's opinion would not matter. Then, 1 week before they were to leave for Davenport and marry without permission, he failed to come. Nell asked whether he had written. Ruth said there had been one envelope. It contained the rail ticket she had bought for him, folded in half, and no message. She did not mention that she had waited at the station for 4 hours while a summer storm shook the roof. She did not mention the porter who watched with pity as each westbound train came and went. She did not mention being sick behind the baggage shed, one hand pressed to the life she had only just learned was inside her. Some truths could be given whole. Others had to be carried to the table, one dish at a time. Nell's eyes remained on the soup. She asked if Thomas had ever learned that Ruth was carrying a child. There it was. The question Ruth had avoided for 16 years did not arrive with thunder. It came in her daughter's quiet voice while coal settled in the stove. Ruth said no. Nell lifted her eyes. Ruth could not protect her with another half-truth. She said Thomas Mercer was her father. For a long while, the greenhouse contained no sound except the soft popping of the stove and the rustle of a mouse beneath the potting bench. Nell did not cry. She did not embrace Ruth. She asked whether Thomas knew now. Ruth said he did not. Nell asked whether Abigail had known. Ruth looked toward the black windows. Reflected there, mother and daughter sat opposite each other under one hanging lamp. Ruth's face was pale and narrow. Nell's was younger, fuller, with Thomas's steady eyes. Yes, Ruth said. Abigail had known before Thomas failed to come to the station. Nell stood so quickly that the table shook. One bowl tipped, sending a pale line of soup across the newspaper. She caught it before it fell. That small act of control hurt Ruth more than an accusation. Nell wanted to know whether Abigail had told Thomas. Ruth said she did not believe so. Then why, Nell asked, had Ruth never told him herself? Ruth had answers. She had 18 years of them. At first she had been ashamed, then furious, then poor, then too proud to let the Mercer family decide whether her child deserved food, schooling, or a name. By the time she had the greenhouse and could no longer be threatened with losing Nell, Thomas was married. Later his wife was ill. Later Ruth heard that the wife had died. Later Nell was old enough to understand. Later became a room Ruth entered every year and never managed to leave. None of those answers changed what her silence had taken from Nell. Ruth said only that she had believed she was protecting them both. Nell wiped the spilled soup with a cloth. She moved carefully, refusing to let her hands tremble. She said that perhaps Ruth had protected herself too. Then she took her coat and went out through the workroom door. Ruth did not follow. Nell always walked to the river when she was angry. She would stay on the lit streets, past the flour mill, and sit where the levee wall blocked the wind. Ruth knew every turn she would take. Knowing did not make the empty workroom easier. She cleared the bowls, she banked the stove, she walked between the benches, touching leaves as she passed. At the far end stood a camellia that had not flowered in 11 years. It had come from the old Mercer conservatory after a boiler pipe burst during the winter Abigail closed the house. Augusta had ordered every frost-burned plant thrown away. The gardener, unwilling to kill what might still live, had brought the camellia to Ruth under a horse blanket. Its branches were black, its root ball frozen hard. Ruth cut it down nearly to the soil and waited. Year after year it produced glossy leaves and no bloom. Abigail once saw it during a funeral order and recognized the blue porcelain tub. She told Ruth that some things survived merely because no one had been sensible enough to finish them. Ruth had answered that survival did not require permission. It was one of the few times she had seen Abigail flinch. Now a single tight bud showed beneath the leaves. Ruth touched it with one finger. The bud was green, stubborn, and not yet ready to reveal its color. When Nell returned an hour later, she went directly to the narrow room above the seed shop where they slept. She did not come down again. Ruth remained beside the camellia until the lamp burned low. The next morning, Thomas Mercer came to the greenhouse carrying the broken voice of 1891 in a wooden case. He arrived before the shop bell, while frost still silvered the street. Ruth was shoveling coal into the boiler room when his knock sounded on the outer door. She considered letting him wait. Then she saw Nell at the top of the stairs. Her daughter was dressed for school, her books strapped together, her face composed. She looked from the door to Ruth and said that hiding had already lasted long enough. Ruth opened it. Thomas stepped into the wet heat and removed his hat. He looked as if he had not slept. A line of soot marked one thumb, and the wooden case beneath his arm was tied with cotton tape. He explained that the cylinder could probably be repaired. The two halves had separated along an old fissure without crumbling. At his mother's house, he had found a second machine fitted with an early narrow mandrel, the type on which the recording had been made. With patience, he could support the wax from inside and make a transfer onto a new blank. Ruth asked why he was telling her. Because her voice was on it, he said. Whatever else the cylinder contained, he would not play it again without her consent. That courtesy would have moved her once. Now it angered her. She asked whether he had consulted Augusta before offering a woman like Ruth a share in a Mercer decision. Thomas accepted the blow. He said Augusta wanted the cylinder destroyed. Nell had come down the stairs. She stood beside the work table in her brown school dress, one hand on the strap around her books. Thomas saw her and stopped. The resemblance was not the simple likeness that makes strangers remark on eyes or chin. It lived in the way they held still. Thomas and Nell both seemed to listen with their entire bodies, as if the smallest sound might contain an instruction. He asked whether he had interrupted a family matter. Ruth said he had been interrupting one for 18 years. Nell closed her eyes. The words had left Ruth without permission. Thomas stared at her. His hand tightened around the case. Ruth could have told him then. She could have said that the girl before him was his daughter, that Abigail had known, that the recording in his hands might contain the hour in which 3 lives were bent out of shape. But Nell spoke first. She said she would be late for school. Thomas stepped aside at once. He opened the outer door for her. As Nell passed him, he looked at the worn cuff of her coat, the books under her arm, the amber ring around her gray pupils. She thanked him with formal politeness and walked into the cold. Thomas watched until she turned the corner. Then he asked Ruth how old she was. Ruth said 16. The color in his face changed. He set the wooden case on the work table with extraordinary care. 16, he repeated. Born when? Ruth untied her work apron. Her fingers had begun to shake, so she folded the apron once, then again. March of 1892. Thomas gripped the edge of the table. Ruth had imagined his reaction as often as she had imagined Nell's. She expected disbelief, calculation, perhaps anger. She did not expect him to look toward the door as if the girl who had just walked through it had taken the ground with her. He asked whether Nell was his. Ruth said yes. Outside, the first factory whistle sounded along the river. Its low call passed through the greenhouse glass. Men would be crossing the bridge with dinner pails. Women would be lighting stoves and waking children. Briar Glen was beginning an ordinary day. Thomas Mercer stood among pots of damp earth and learned that ordinary life had gone on without him for 16 years. He asked if Ruth was certain. She struck him. The sound was small in the vast wet room. Thomas did not lift a hand to his cheek. Ruth told him he could accuse her of cruelty, pride, or cowardice, and she would have no defense. But he would not stand beneath the roof that had fed his daughter and ask whether Ruth knew who had fathered her. He lowered his eyes. He said she was right. That made her angrier than an argument would have. She turned away and began straightening packets of seed. Nasturtium, larkspur, sweet pea. The names blurred. Thomas asked why she had not told him. Ruth said his mother had promised to ruin her father, take the child, and print enough filth in the Gazette to make every respectable door close before Ruth reached it. Abigail had also said Thomas knew of the pregnancy and wanted nothing to do with it. Thomas whispered that it was not true. Ruth faced him. He had not known, he said. He had gone to the station that night. He had arrived after the westbound train because Abigail locked him in the newspaper composing room and sent the press foreman away with the key. By the time he forced a transom, Ruth was gone. 2 days later, he received her rail ticket in an envelope with a line written across it. Do not follow me. Ruth felt something cold open beneath her ribs. She had not written those words. Thomas said he recognized that now. At 29, angry and humiliated, he had recognized only the decision he feared she might make. His mother told him Ruth had accepted money to leave. She showed him a receipt bearing Silas Hale's signature. Ruth's father had signed many things during the last year of the nursery: mortgages, notes, delivery receipts, papers Abigail placed beneath his hand after whiskey had made the words swim. He had died believing he had cost Ruth her future. Thomas untied the case. Between the pieces of cotton lay the black wax cylinder. Up close, its surface showed thousands of fine grooves, each one holding a fraction of breath from people who had believed the moment was already gone. He said the recording might tell them which of their memories had been built for them. Ruth looked at the broken wax. Then she looked toward the corner where the camellia carried its single, unopened bud. She told him to repair it, but he was not to play 1 second of it in the opera house, the Mercer house, or any room Augusta could enter without knocking. Thomas asked where she wanted it played. Ruth rested her palm on the work table her daughter had scrubbed every Saturday since she was 9. Here, she said. If the past intended to speak, it would do so in the house that had survived it. Thomas began the repair that afternoon. He carried an early Mercer phonograph from his mother's attic in a wagon padded with quilts. The machine was older than the models displayed in the Chicago shops. Its oak cabinet had darkened almost to brown, and its brass horn bore a dent left by some forgotten fall. Thomas set it on the greenhouse work table, removed the reproducer, and arranged his tools beside Ruth's pruning knives. The two kinds of work looked strange together. Tiny screws, a camel hair brush, softened wax, and a narrow supporting sleeve lay between clay pots and bundles of willow stakes. Ruth kept expecting him to ask for silence or more room. Instead, he adapted to the greenhouse as if he had always worked beneath dripping glass. He came each morning after Nell left for school and departed before she returned. That was Ruth's condition. Thomas obeyed it for 3 days. On the 4th, a snow squall delayed the streetcar and released the school children early. Nell entered the shop while he was fitting the cylinder halves around the supporting sleeve. She stopped so suddenly that cold air rushed past her and lifted the brown paper on the work table. Thomas rose. The cylinder remained beneath a glass bell to keep dust away. Nell asked whether he came there often. Ruth said it was temporary. Thomas said he was repairing a recording. Nell looked from one to the other. Their careful phrases told her what neither had courage to say plainly. Arrangements had been made around her again. She removed her wet hat. Then she asked Thomas whether he knew who she was. Thomas's face changed. He had spent 4 days asking Ruth when he might speak to Nell, and 4 days accepting her refusal. Now the decision no longer belonged to either of them. He said that Ruth had told him. Nell wanted to know when. Thomas admitted that he had learned the previous morning. It had been 4 mornings, but Ruth did not correct him. Time could not be counted honestly in that room. Nell placed her books on a chair. She asked if he believed it. Thomas said he had never believed anything more quickly or regretted anything more completely. Nell considered this. She was not softened by it. She asked what right he had to regret a life he had not lived. Thomas lowered his eyes. None, he said, but regret rarely waited for permission. For the first time since the opera house, Nell looked at him with something other than controlled anger. Ruth recognized curiosity and feared it more. Nell went to the phonograph. She leaned beneath the glass bell without touching it. Thomas explained the repair. The cylinder had to be supported from within so that the broken edges met without pressure. He would make a shallow matrix from each section, then reproduce the grooves onto a fresh wax blank 1 band at a time. It might take several attempts. Some words would be lost forever. Nell asked if he knew what the preserved words might say. Thomas said he did not. She looked at Ruth. Ruth said the recording began as a festival song. A traveling exhibitor had brought the machine to Briar Glen so townspeople could hear their own voices. Thomas played piano. Ruth sang. Afterward, Abigail called Ruth behind the scenery. Nell asked what Abigail had said. Ruth told her it was better to hear a true voice than a remembered one. Nell's mouth tightened. She said remembered voices were all Ruth had given her until now. Then she turned back to Thomas and asked if she might watch him work. Ruth answered before he could. There was schoolwork to finish and an order of funeral palms to prepare. Nell did not raise her voice. She said she had tied funeral palms since she was 11. She had never seen a voice repaired. Thomas looked at Ruth, waiting. Ruth wanted to send him away. She wanted the cylinder out of the greenhouse and every Mercer name scraped from the glass. Instead, she saw how closely Nell watched the machine. Denial had already cost enough. She allowed half an hour. Nell stayed for 2. Thomas showed her how the stylus traveled through the groove. He let her turn the mandrel by hand and listen through a rubber hearing tube to the faint vibration made by an unrecorded blank. He never touched her except once, when a sliver of wax clung to her cuff and he brushed it away before thinking. Both of them froze. Ruth pretended not to see. At supper, Nell asked Thomas whether he had other children. The question came while he was packing his tools. He said no. Ruth knew about his marriage to Cecily Ward. The Gazette had printed 2 columns on the wedding. Cecily was the daughter of a Davenport grain broker, accomplished in French, watercolor, and the management of servants. Ruth had seen the bride once from a distance at the train station, wearing a traveling coat the color of cream. Nell asked if he had wanted children. Thomas closed the wooden toolbox. He said Cecily had wanted them desperately. There had been 3 pregnancies and no child who lived longer than a day. After the last, she never fully recovered. She died of pneumonia in 1902. The information entered the room without accusation, yet Ruth felt accused by it. While she had guarded Nell from a father she believed indifferent, Thomas had buried infants whose faces he barely had time to learn. Nell's anger altered. It did not disappear. It made room for sorrow. She said she was sorry. Thomas thanked her. Then he put on his coat and left. That night Ruth heard Nell crying in the room across the narrow hall. She stood outside the door with one hand raised. When Nell had been small, grief was simple enough to meet. A scraped knee required washing. Fever required cool cloths. A nightmare required the weight of Ruth beside her until morning. This grief had been planted before Nell's birth and trained along the walls of her life like ivy. Ruth could not pull it down without bringing plaster with it. She returned to her own room. On Sunday, Augusta Mercer came to the greenhouse after church. She arrived in a closed carriage, though the weather was clear. The driver remained outside, reins in hand, while Augusta entered carrying the cold scent of wool, lavender salts, and the Mercer house. 3 customers were selecting seed packets. Mrs. Drury wanted sweet alyssum for a border. The baker's wife was buying beans. Young Clara Finch had come for a pot of primroses to take to her mother. They all recognized Augusta and became intensely interested in gardening. Augusta asked to speak with Ruth privately. Ruth said anything concerning an order could be discussed at the counter. Augusta rested her gloved hands on the silver knob of her walking stick. She announced, softly enough to claim discretion and clearly enough for every customer to hear, that no order was involved. She had come because Thomas had been seen entering Ruth's establishment each morning. Their mother had not been in the grave 2 months, and already idle tongues were attaching his name to a woman whose history in Briar Glen had once required great charity. The baker's wife put a packet of beans back upside down. Ruth felt heat rise beneath her collar. Abigail had been more skillful. She would have called the threat concern and the insult mercy. Augusta, less intelligent and more frightened, displayed the blade. Ruth asked whose charity Augusta meant. Augusta said the town had accepted Ruth's account that Nell was the orphan child of her sister Margaret. No one had demanded documents. No one had asked why Margaret's supposed husband had never been named. Briar Glen had permitted Ruth to make an honest living. It would be unfortunate if old questions returned because Thomas had confused pity with obligation. Nell was in the rear workroom. Ruth could hear the clipping of her shears stop. Ruth came around the counter. She had been insulted at Mercer tables, passed over by church committees, cheated by hotel buyers, and addressed through servants by women who entered her greenhouse wearing flowers she had kept alive. She had learned to survive each injury without spectacle. But Augusta had carried the town's suspicion into Nell's house and placed it where the child could hear. Ruth told her that the honest living Augusta mentioned had provided flowers for 3 Mercer weddings and 4 Mercer funerals. It had replaced the Gazette's dead geraniums every spring on credit, because Abigail disliked receiving bills before June. It had also supplied the white roses now lying over Abigail's grave. If the Mercer family wished to examine the honesty of its arrangements, Ruth would gladly begin with those. Augusta's face whitened. Mrs. Drury made a small sound that might have been a cough. Ruth continued. Thomas came to repair property discovered in his mother's cabinet. He worked in full view of Cedar Avenue. If Augusta saw scandal in a man handling a machine while a woman repotted ferns, then years at the Gazette had given her a poor opinion of news. Augusta said Ruth had always mistaken defiance for dignity. From the rear room, Nell stepped into view. She held a bundle of palm fronds against her apron. Her face was calm, but a narrow cut crossed one finger where the shears had slipped. Augusta saw the blood and looked away first. Nell asked whether Mrs. Mercer required flowers. Augusta said she did not. Nell opened the shop door. The gesture was unmistakable. Augusta left without another word. The three customers completed their purchases in embarrassed silence. By noon, Mrs. Peabody sent her maid for twice as many cyclamen as the library needed. At 2, the pastor's wife ordered altar lilies for Easter, though Easter was 7 weeks away. Neither woman mentioned Augusta. In small towns, support often arrived disguised as unnecessary flowers. Ruth should have been grateful. Instead, she watched Nell wrap her cut finger and knew the injury Augusta caused would not close so easily. The Gazette printed nothing on Monday. On Tuesday, it carried a small notice beneath the weather report. The Ladies' Library Association, it said, had postponed the Abigail Mercer Memorial while certain historical materials were authenticated. The public was reminded that objects found among private effects remained the property of the estate and should not become fuel for indecent speculation. No name appeared. None was needed. By afternoon, 2 funeral orders had been canceled. A bride's mother came for the deposit on 6 table arrangements, explaining that her husband preferred a supplier without political associations. A hotel clerk returned 3 palms because their leaves were browning, though the leaves were as green as June. Ruth counted the money in the till after closing. It would pay Cole for 9 days. Nell offered the savings from her music lessons. Ruth refused. Nell said pride was expensive. Ruth answered that a daughter's future was not household money. Nell looked toward the phonograph under its cloth. She said that apparently her past was. They worked without speaking until dark. Thomas learned of the notice in Chicago. He had gone there for new blanks, binding compound, and a recording lathe delicate enough for the transfer. He returned on the night train and came straight from the station. Ruth found him at the greenhouse door shortly after dawn, a traveling case in one hand and the folded Gazette in the other. He asked how much business had been lost. Ruth said it was none of his concern. He said Augusta had made it his concern. Ruth would not accept money. Thomas had expected that. He proposed placing a public advertisement stating that the greenhouse had been hired by his company as a temporary laboratory and that his visits were professional. Ruth laughed once. The sound held no amusement. A Mercer notice, she told him, had created the shame. Another Mercer notice would not restore her dignity. It would merely certify that she had been declared safe. Thomas looked at the newspaper in his hand. Then he walked across the street to the Gazette office. Ruth saw him enter. An hour passed. Then another. At 11, the press began to run. The machine's rhythm could be heard 4 blocks away, a heavy iron heartbeat beneath the ordinary noises of the town. Shortly before noon, a newsboy crossed Cedar Avenue carrying a fresh sheet. Thomas had used the front page. The notice did not defend Ruth's virtue. It did not describe her as a deserving woman or an old family friend. It stated that Thomas Mercer, as executor of Abigail Mercer's personal papers and principal owner of the Mercer Gazette, had ordered an inquiry into the misuse of the newspaper for private intimidation. Until that inquiry ended, Augusta Mercer would exercise no editorial authority. It added that Ruth Hale had neither requested nor received assistance from the Mercer family, and that any suggestion otherwise was false. At the bottom, in type large enough to be read from the pavement, appeared one more sentence. The Gazette regrets that silence has too often been printed as fact. Ruth read it twice. Across the street, Thomas emerged from the newspaper office. Augusta followed him to the door. Even at a distance, Ruth could see the fury in her posture. Thomas said something. Augusta lifted her walking stick as if she might strike him, then let it fall. He crossed to the greenhouse. Ruth placed the paper on the counter. She said he had made matters worse. He said he had made them louder. Ruth told him that loudness was a luxury for men whose names already owned the press. Thomas took off his hat. He admitted that he did not know how to repair a reputation without behaving like a Mercer. It was the only instrument he had been taught to use. Ruth almost answered sharply. Then she saw that he was not asking to be praised. He was naming the defect. She said instruments could be learned. Thomas glanced at the covered phonograph. So could repairs, he said. The advertisement brought back the canceled funeral orders. The bride's mother returned, though she claimed a cousin had persuaded her. By Friday, strangers came into the shop merely to buy 1 packet of seed and look at Ruth. Curiosity spent money as readily as kindness. Ruth endured it. Thomas worked. Nell no longer avoided him. She sat at the end of the table after school, copying Latin declensions while he prepared the new blank. Sometimes she asked questions about Chicago. Thomas described elevated trains, electric signs along State Street, and shops where customers could choose recorded songs from catalogs thicker than a family Bible. He told her about the factory women who shaved and polished cylinders, and the demonstrators who sang the same verse 50 times into recording horns. Nell wanted to know whether a woman could become an engineer. Thomas said he employed two who knew more about wax composition than any man in his works. Ruth heard the answer from the potting bench. She wondered whether it was true or whether Thomas had shaped it to please Nell. Later, she disliked herself for wondering. Distrust, once useful, had become a habit that bit even an offered hand. Nell told him she meant to teach music. Thomas asked if she sang. She said everyone in Briar Glen sang badly enough to be asked into a church choir. Thomas smiled. Ruth saw her own guarded humor reflected back from her daughter and his smile receiving it. The sight tightened something in her chest. He did not ask Nell to call him father. He did not give her presents. Once, he brought a paper cone of roasted chestnuts from the station and set it near the stove without saying they were for her. Nell ate 3 and left the rest between them. Their caution was more intimate than affection. Ruth found herself resenting every likeness they discovered. Nell held a tuning fork by the stem exactly as Thomas did. She counted measures under her breath. When thinking, both rubbed the side of one thumb with the nail of the other. These small inheritances had lived in Ruth's house unnamed. Now Thomas recognized them with a look, and Ruth felt as if he were claiming rooms he had not helped build. One evening, after Nell went upstairs, Ruth told him so. Thomas was cleaning the stylus. He listened without defending himself. Ruth said he had missed fever nights, first words, torn shoes, school fees, and the winter Nell stopped breathing during croup while snow blocked the doctor's carriage. He did not get to arrive with a box of tools and be rewarded because her eyes resembled his. Thomas said he knew. Ruth demanded that he stop saying that. He looked at her then. He said he did not know those nights. He knew only that they existed and that Ruth had endured them. If she wanted him to deny the loss so she could punish him for failing to understand it, he could not. He was already being punished by every ordinary fact he learned. Ruth turned away. He asked what Nell's first word had been. Ruth did not answer. He returned to the stylus. After several minutes, Ruth said it had been light. Nell had pointed at the greenhouse roof at dawn, opened both hands, and said the word with complete certainty. Thomas bowed his head over the machine. Ruth saw one drop fall onto the metal plate beside his hand. Neither mentioned it. By the end of the second week, the fresh cylinder held 43 seconds of transferred sound. They listened through hearing tubes, one at a time. There was piano, distant laughter, Ruth's young voice beginning the song, and Thomas joining on the second verse. The tones were thin, veiled by scratches, yet the two voices leaned toward each other with an ease that made Ruth close her eyes. She had forgotten that happiness could be audible. The recording stopped just as applause began. Everything beyond that point remained trapped in the cracked section. Thomas said the damaged grooves might be impossible to lift without a better stylus. He knew a man in St. Louis who had worked with the original exhibitor and still kept experimental equipment. The name of the exhibitor was Gideon Wren. Ruth remembered him as a restless man with red side whiskers, a checked waistcoat, and the habit of speaking to his phonograph as if it were a stubborn horse. He had left Briar Glen the morning after the festival. Thomas said Gideon had died, but his son Elias continued the business. Elias would be at the electrical exhibition in Des Moines the following week. He proposed taking the cylinder there. Ruth refused to let it leave the greenhouse. Thomas said Elias could come to Briar Glen. Ruth suspected Thomas could persuade anyone with enough railroad money. She disliked the thought of owing another favor. Nell, listening from the stairs, said she would pay the man's fare from her music savings. Ruth told her not to interfere. Nell came down. She said the voice belonged to all three of them now. Ruth had carried the secret, Thomas had inherited the machine, and Nell had inherited the consequences. If a fare had to be paid, she would contribute. Thomas looked at Ruth, but wisely said nothing. The next day, Nell sold the small gold brooch Ruth had given her on her 15th birthday. Ruth discovered the empty box that evening and was furious. Nell placed the money on the work table. She said the brooch had belonged to Ruth's mother and should have felt precious, but it had never held anything except the obligation to be grateful. The cylinder, ugly and cracked, contained a truth every adult had decided she could live without. Ruth stared at the coins. Her first impulse was to forbid the sale, retrieve the brooch, and protect Nell from wasting her inheritance on pain. Then she understood that this was precisely the habit that had brought them there. Ruth deciding which burden Nell was permitted to choose. She closed Nell's fingers over the money. They would use only enough for 1/3 of the fare, she said. Thomas would pay 1/3, Ruth would pay the rest. Nell agreed. Thomas sent the telegram. Elias Wren arrived in Briar Glen on a rainy Thursday wearing a coat too thin for the season and carrying a leather case hand-lettered with the words, "Voices Preserved." He was 60, stooped, and nearly deaf. When Ruth gave her name, he removed his spectacles. He remembered her. More importantly, he remembered the cylinder. He looked at the two black halves beneath the glass bell and whispered that his father had searched for them until the day he died. Thomas asked why. Elias sat beside the work table. Rain moved over the greenhouse roof in long silver strokes. Nell remained close to Ruth, and for once, Ruth was grateful for the contact of her shoulder. Elias explained that the June festival recording had continued after the public demonstration because Gideon Wren was experimenting with a longer spring. The machine stood behind a painted canvas wall. When Abigail Mercer called Ruth into that space, Gideon heard their argument through his hearing tube. He had not intended to spy, but he recognized the danger in Abigail's words. Gideon stopped the machine, removed the cylinder, and hid it in his case. Before he could give it to Ruth or Thomas, the sheriff arrived with a complaint that his exhibition license was fraudulent. Abigail paid his fine on the condition that he leave town before sunrise and surrender every recording made at the festival. Gideon gave her the public cylinders. He kept the one bearing Ruth's initials. For 11 years, it traveled with him from fair to fair. Then, in 1902, a fire destroyed Gideon's wagon outside Peoria. He believed the cylinder had melted with the rest. He never knew how it returned to Abigail's cabinet. Ruth looked at Thomas. Thomas said his mother had been in Peoria in 1902, attending Cecily during her last illness. Elias opened his leather case. Inside lay tools finer than sewing needles and a narrow glass diaphragm mounted in brass. He said the fire had probably caused the crack. If Abigail recovered the cylinder from the wreckage, she had kept it 7 years without playing it in public or destroying it. Nell asked why a woman would preserve the evidence of her own cruelty. Elias looked toward Abigail's portrait on the folded Gazette beside the stove. Some people, he said, kept the truth near because punishment felt safer when they could decide each morning not to face it. Ruth thought of 18 birthdays, 18 winters. 18 times she had decided the same thing. For the first time, Abigail's secret did not feel separate from her own. Elias worked until after midnight. The greenhouse grew cold around the circle of lamplight. Ruth fed coal to the stove. Nell fell asleep in a chair with her cheek against a folded apron. Thomas covered her with his overcoat, but did not touch her hair, though Ruth saw how badly he wanted to. Elias mounted the glass diaphragm, sharpened a sliver of bamboo, and listened to each damaged groove through a single tube pressed to his better ear. When the stylus encountered a gap, he marked the place in blue pencil on a strip of paper. Thomas turned the mandrel. The two men spoke less as the work became more difficult. Near 1 in the morning, Elias lifted both hands. He had captured another minute and 12 seconds. The new cylinder was warm from cutting. Thomas waited until it cooled, then fitted the hearing tubes. Ruth woke Nell. No one suggested postponing the moment until morning. They listened in order. Thomas went first. At the beginning he looked only intent. The young voices sang. Applause scratched across the wax like dry leaves. Then came the thump of something placed near the horn. A woman's voice entered, faint but firm. Thomas closed his eyes. Ruth did not need the hearing tube to know it was Abigail. The recording lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, Thomas remained bent over the machine, the rubber tubes hanging from his hands. Nell listened next. Her face changed at the same place. She gripped the table when the words reached the point Ruth had dreaded. At the end, she removed the tubes and laid them down carefully. Ruth listened last. Sound traveled through the rubber and placed her beneath the canvas wall of the exhibition hall again. She heard 27-year-old Ruth breathing too quickly. She heard the rustle of Abigail's silk dress. She heard Abigail say that Thomas had been offered a partnership in his uncle's Chicago printing works and would lose it if he married beneath him. Young Ruth answered that Thomas could choose for himself. Abigail said he already had. There was a pause, followed by the sound of paper unfolding. Abigail described the mortgage on Silas Hale's nursery and the accusation waiting at the sheriff's office. Forged signatures on 3 seed contracts, each one written while Silas was drunk. If Ruth went to the station the following Thursday, the accusation would be filed. Her father would spend his last years in prison. The nursery would be sold. Any child born to Ruth would begin life with a criminal's name. Then came Ruth's voice, lower. She asked how Abigail knew about the child. The present Ruth pressed both hands against the table. On the recording, Abigail said she had eyes in the doctor's office and servants who understood loyalty. She told Ruth that Thomas had been informed and had called the pregnancy a trap. Young Ruth made a sound, not a sob, something smaller and more terrible, the sound of belief entering where love had been. Abigail offered $200 and a train ticket to Chicago. Ruth refused the money. She said she would leave because she would not let her child grow beneath the Mercers' contempt. But Abigail would never be able to buy the reason. The groove broke there. Only harsh scratching followed. Ruth removed the tubes. No one spoke for several seconds. Thomas stood with one hand over his mouth. Nell looked at Ruth as if seeing both the woman beside her and the young voice under the canvas. Elias said there was more on the damaged original. He could see at least 30 seconds of grooves beyond the break, perhaps a minute. But the wax had warped. To transfer them, he would need to soften the cylinder gradually and risk losing everything already preserved. Thomas said no. The answer came too quickly. Ruth understood. The recording had already condemned Abigail and excused Thomas. More sound could complicate both. She asked Elias what he advised. He said a preserved lie was still a lie. A damaged truth deserved the same courage as a whole one. Nell touched the new cylinder. She did not ask permission. She said they should continue. Thomas looked at her. Shame passed across his face. He admitted that he was afraid. Nell said so was she. Thomas nodded. They decided to rest 3 hours and begin again at dawn. No one truly slept. Ruth lay on the narrow cot in the back room and listened to Thomas moving beyond the partition. She remembered another night, a lifetime earlier, when they had remained awake in her father's empty packing shed because rain had flooded the road. Thomas had talked about machines that would preserve ordinary voices. Not just opera singers and presidents, but children reciting lessons, mothers telling stories, men laughing before age changed the sound. He believed people would become kinder if they could hear whom they had once been. Ruth had told him people would only learn to lie more carefully. At 27, they had mistaken disagreement for a promise that conversation would never end. Before dawn, Thomas knocked softly on the partition. Ruth sat up. He did not enter. Through the thin wood, he said that on the morning after she left, he had gone to the Hale nursery. Silas was drunk and would say only that Ruth had chosen sense over disgrace. Thomas searched her room. All her clothes were gone except the blue festival dress. For years he believed she had left it because it reminded her of him. Ruth closed her eyes. The dress had not fit over her changing body. She had abandoned it because she could take one carpet bag and wool would be more useful than blue silk in a Chicago winter. Thomas said he wrote to her sister Margaret in Milwaukee. The letters were returned. He hired an inquiry agent once, but Abigail learned of it and told Cecily. The argument nearly ended his marriage before it began. Thomas stopped searching. Ruth asked why he was telling her this now. He said he wanted no more years built from omissions that made him look better or worse than he had been. He had searched, but not enough. He had doubted his mother, but not enough. He had loved Ruth, but not enough to disgrace himself for the truth. Ruth lay with her hands folded over the blanket. She told him that she too could have written. Abigail controlled the Gazette, not every post office in America. Ruth knew the Chicago works where Thomas had gone. She passed its street twice during her first year in the city. Each time she crossed to the other side. Thomas asked why. Because a woman carrying a child could survive anger better than a second rejection, Ruth said. The words remained between them, separated by the wall. At dawn, they returned to the machine. Elias placed the broken cylinder inside a tin box surrounded by warm sand. Every few minutes he rotated it. The wax relaxed by degrees. The crack narrowed. A sweet, oily smell rose from the box. Ruth watched the black surface soften and thought of memory. Heat could make a broken thing meet itself again. It could also erase the grooves. At 9, someone pounded on the shop door. Augusta stood outside with the county sheriff and Mr. Vale, the Mercer attorney. Mr. Vale carried an order from the probate court. The original cylinder had been listed among Abigail's effects. As co-executor, Augusta had requested its immediate return. Any copy made from it also belonged to the estate until the court determined whether private material could be exhibited. Thomas read the order in the doorway. He told the sheriff the cylinder was too fragile to move. Augusta looked past him and saw Elias, the machine, and the warm sand. She ordered the sheriff to enter. Ruth blocked the door. The sheriff had known her since childhood. He once brought his wife's dying fern to the greenhouse in a wash basin. He would not meet her eyes. He said he had to perform his duty. Nell stood beside the phonograph. Her face had gone white. Ruth asked Mr. Vale whether a dead woman's estate could own the sound of a living woman's voice. The attorney said that was a question for a judge. Elias quietly removed the fresh transfer and slipped it into his leather case. Augusta saw the motion. She demanded both cylinders. Thomas stepped between his sister and the table. He said that if she forced the original from its support, it might crumble. Augusta answered that their mother's dignity mattered more than damaged wax. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said their mother had spent a lifetime confusing those things. Augusta struck him with her walking stick. The silver knob caught his temple. Nell cried out. Thomas staggered against the counter and a line of blood appeared near his hair. The sheriff seized Augusta's wrist. For one suspended instant, the entire room saw the Mercer family without its newspaper voice, a frightened widow, an aging son, a dead mother's command, and a girl whose existence made all of them uncertain. Augusta began to weep. She did not weep gently. Her face folded and her body shook. She said Thomas had always been permitted to leave. He had gone to Chicago, built machines, married Cecily, and returned only when duty required him. Augusta had remained. She had cared for their mother through 2 strokes, read the Gazette aloud when Abigail's eyes failed, slept outside her door, and learned which spoonful of medicine she would accept. Now Thomas meant to repay that devotion by turning Abigail into a monster before the town. Ruth's anger altered. She still despised what Augusta had done, but she saw the prison inside the woman's mourning dress. Thomas pressed a handkerchief to his temple. He said Augusta's years of care were real. So was the harm their mother had done. One truth did not bury another. Augusta looked at Nell. Her gaze traveled over the girl's face with recognition so complete that denial became impossible. She whispered that Abigail had been right to be afraid. Nell asked what a dead woman could still fear from her. Augusta said Nell did not understand. If the town learned she was Thomas's daughter, every kindness Abigail had ever performed would be called calculation. Every public cause would be stained. The library, the hospital wing, the widow's fund, all of it would become hush money in people's minds. Nell answered that if goodness could be destroyed by the truth about the person who performed it, perhaps it had been built for display. Augusta stared at her. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Ruth knew he heard himself in Nell's measured severity. The sheriff cleared his throat. The order still stood. Elias proposed a compromise. The original could remain on its support in the greenhouse under seal until it cooled. The new transfer would go into the sheriff's custody. No one would play or copy either until the hearing in 3 days. Mr. Vale agreed. The sheriff placed the fresh cylinder in a padded evidence box. He tied it with red tape and melted a seal over the knot. Ruth watched the preserved voices leave the room. This time, she did not let silence feel like safety. She asked Thomas to tell the sheriff, the attorney, Augusta, and Elias who Nell was. Nell turned toward her. Ruth's heart beat so hard that the glass panes seemed to tremble with it. Thomas looked to Nell for permission. She gave one small nod. He said Eleanor Hale was his daughter. The sheriff removed his hat. Mr. Vale's professional expression failed for half a second. Augusta seemed to shrink inside her black dress. No trumpet sounded. No law changed. The words entered the greenhouse and became part of the air. Ruth had feared them for 16 years. Spoken aloud, they were only true. By evening, all Briar Glen knew. The source varied according to the teller. Some blamed the sheriff's deputy. Some blamed Mrs. Drury, who had not been present but possessed a gift for learning what she had missed. Some said Augusta herself told the Gazette staff before locking her office. Truth traveled no more honorably than gossip, but it traveled faster once given a name. At school the next morning, the headmistress asked Nell to leave the Founders Recital Choir until the trustees could consider whether publicity surrounding her family would distract from the program. Nell came home before noon carrying her music. Ruth found her in the camellia corner. She had placed the sheets on the floor and was pulling weeds from empty pots with bare hands. Ruth wanted to go to the school and demand an apology. Nell asked her not to. She said the headmistress had offered to let her remain if she used the name Eleanor Mercer and appeared with Thomas at the recital. The school did not fear illegitimacy, it feared illegitimacy without a powerful man standing beside it. Ruth sat on an overturned pot. She asked what Nell wanted. Nell said she wanted to sing under the name she had carried through every year Thomas did not know her. Ruth said she would. Nell shook her head. Not at the recital. There would always be another room, she said. That afternoon, Thomas went to the school alone. He did not threaten the trustees or mention advertising contracts. He requested the tuition records for the past 6 years and learned that Nell had won her place through examinations and a music scholarship. Then he asked the headmistress to write, in her own hand, the reason Nell had been excluded. The woman refused. Thomas left. Ruth heard what happened from the janitor's wife. She had expected him to purchase justice. Instead, he had asked Prejudice to sign its name. The trustees reversed the decision by supper. Nell declined to return. Thomas did not try to persuade her. He came to the greenhouse after dark and found Ruth alone. Nell had gone to practice at the Baptist church, whose choir mistress declared that no committee on earth could make a contralto less useful. Thomas's wound had been stitched. A white bandage showed beneath his hair. He told Ruth the court would hear the matter in the county courthouse. Augusta intended to argue that playing the cylinder would violate Abigail's privacy and damage property held for the memorial trust. Ruth asked what he intended. Thomas said he would argue that the living voices had a right to be heard. Ruth trimmed roots from a tray of geranium cuttings. She asked whether he meant her voice or his mother's. He did not answer at once. Finally, he said both. He believed Abigail had kept the cylinder because some part of her wanted judgment postponed, not escaped. During her last illness, she often asked whether the cabinet at the Gazette was locked. Augusta assumed she feared theft. Thomas now believed she feared discovery and desired it in equal measure. Ruth said dead people were convenient. They could be assigned any courage the living needed. Thomas accepted that. Then he placed a small paper bundle on the bench. Inside lay the blue festival dress. The silk had faded to gray at the folds. One sleeve was torn. Ruth recognized the row of pearl buttons she had sewn herself. Thomas said he had kept it. After she left, he took it from the nursery before Silas lost the property. It traveled to Chicago in the bottom of his trunk, then to the house he shared with Cecily. He never unfolded it. When Cecily found it, he told her it had belonged to his sister. Ruth looked up sharply. Thomas said Cecily knew he was lying. She did not ask again. He had spent years condemning Abigail's deceptions while using a smaller one to protect his own comfort. He had brought the dress because it belonged to Ruth. She touched the faded silk. Once she had believed clothes retained the shape of the body that wore them. This dress retained only the shape of its folds. Ruth asked if Cecily had been happy. Thomas sat on the edge of the bench. He said there had been kindness in their marriage, respect, long seasons of companionship. There had also been a room neither entered. Cecily knew his grief had begun before her and mistook patience for the key that would eventually open it. Thomas knew her loneliness and mistook duty for love strong enough to cure it. When she was dying, Cecily asked him to promise that if an old truth ever returned, he would not make another woman pay for his fear of it. Ruth folded the dress. She felt no jealousy toward Cecily, only a deep weariness for the number of women required to absorb the consequences of Mercer's silence. Thomas asked if she regretted telling the sheriff. Ruth looked through the glass at the lamps along Cedar Avenue. People passed slowly now, hoping to glimpse the scandalous greenhouse. One boy had pressed his face to a pane that afternoon until Nell sprayed it with the watering hose. Ruth said she regretted that Nell had paid before Thomas did. He asked how he could begin to pay. She told him not to confuse payment with repair. Money could settle coal bills. A public name could reopen a school door. Neither could give Nell the childhood in which she knew where her eyes came from. Thomas said he understood. Ruth told him he did not, but perhaps he had begun. The probate hearing filled the courthouse. Farmers came because market roads were muddy. Shopkeepers closed for an hour. Women from 3 churches occupied the rear benches and pretended interest in property law. The Gazette staff sat together without Augusta, who entered through the side door with Mr. Vale. Nell sat between Ruth and Thomas. She had chosen the place herself. The judge was an old man who disliked phonographs, newspapers, and crowds. He listened to Mr. Vale argue that Abigail's recorded speech had been captured without consent. He listened to Thomas's attorney argue that the cylinder had been made at a public exhibition, contained Ruth's performance, and had been removed from Gideon Wren under coercion. Then he asked Ruth what she wanted. She stood, every head turned. Ruth said she did not want revenge on Abigail. The woman was beyond injury. She wanted her daughter to hear the complete record before the town built another convenient account. After that, Nell could decide whether the recording should be public. The judge looked at Nell. He asked if a girl of 16 was prepared to make a decision that would affect 2 families and a civic institution. Nell stood beside Ruth. She said girls of 16 were considered old enough to carry reputations, marry men chosen for them, work in mills, and bear children whose names courts later questioned. She believed she could decide who heard a cylinder. A murmur moved through the room. The judge removed his spectacles and polished them. He ordered the private completion of the transfer at the greenhouse. Present would be Ruth, Nell, Thomas, Augusta, Elias, the sheriff, and 1 court stenographer. After they heard it, the court would reconvene. Augusta rose. She said she would not attend. The judge told her absence would not stop a dead voice from speaking. Outside the courthouse, a reporter from Des Moines waited with a notebook. Thomas led Nell down the steps, but she pulled her arm free when he tried to shield her face. She said she had hidden before she was born. She did not intend to begin again. The reporter asked whether she would take the Mercer name. Nell answered that a name was not a coat a man could place over a woman when the weather turned bad. The sentence appeared in 3 newspapers by the end of the week. Ruth clipped none of them. The night before the final transfer, the camellia opened. Its single flower was not red as Ruth remembered blossoms in the Mercer Conservatory. It was white at the outer petals and deep rose near the center, as if 2 seasons had argued inside the bud and neither had won. Nell found it at dawn. She called Ruth and Thomas from the work table. They stood together beneath the uneven panes and looked at the bloom. Thomas said his father had given the camellia to Abigail on their 10th wedding anniversary. Ruth had never known. He remembered his mother tending it herself. She allowed gardeners to prune every other plant, but not that one. After his father died, it stopped flowering. Ruth said plants were not symbols merely because people needed them to be. Nell smiled for the first time in days. She said perhaps not, but they had excellent timing. Ruth cut no flower from the branch. She left it where it had chosen to open. The final grooves took 7 hours. Elias began at sunrise. The sheriff watched from a chair near the stove, hat on his knees. The court stenographer sat with sharpened pencils and a stack of paper. Augusta arrived last, without her walking stick and without the black veil she had worn since Abigail's funeral. In plain gray wool, she looked smaller and older. No one spoke to her. The softened cylinder held its shape. Elias guided the glass diaphragm across the warped section a fraction at a time. Sometimes the stylus produced a recognizable vibration. Sometimes it caught only a ridge where heat had erased the sound. At noon, he had transferred 19 seconds. At 3:34. When daylight faded from the roof, he lifted the stylus and said there was no more. The last fresh cylinder waited on the mandrel. They arranged themselves around the machine. The narrow hearing tubes allowed only 2 people to listen at once. Ruth insisted that Nell and Augusta hear the first playing. Augusta refused. Nell picked up one tube and held the other toward her. She said Mrs. Mercer had spent 18 years deciding which truth Nell could bear. She would not be permitted to look away now that Nell had a choice. Augusta took the tube. Thomas turned the crank. Elias lowered the reproducer. The recording began where the earlier transfer ended. Young Ruth's footsteps faded. Canvas rustled. For several seconds there was nothing but the uneven spinning of the machine. Then a second young woman's voice pleaded with Abigail to call Ruth back. Augusta dropped the hearing tube. The rubber struck the table and swung. Nell caught it. She held it out again. Augusta's lips had gone gray. She pressed the tube to her ear. Ruth watched her hear herself at 24. On the cylinder, young Augusta said Thomas would discover the truth. He would go to the station. He would ask why Ruth had left. Their mother could not lock every door forever. Abigail answered that one locked door at the proper hour was enough. Augusta said she would not carry the envelope. Abigail told her she already had. There was a thin cry of protest. Then Abigail described what Augusta stood to lose if Thomas married Ruth. The Gazette shares would pass to him at 30. He would sell the paper and take the money west. Augusta, unmarried and unable to inherit the controlling interest under her father's trust, would depend on Thomas's generosity. Abigail said Ruth's child would come before a sister who had never learned to make herself lovable. Young Augusta began to weep. Abigail's voice softened. She told her daughter that families survived because someone performed the cruelty others were too weak to perform. One day, Thomas would thank them both. The recording ended with Augusta asking whether God could hear something said behind canvas. The answer, if Abigail gave one, was gone. The cylinder turned in silence. Augusta removed the tube. For the first time since Ruth had known her, there was no posture left in her body. She bent forward with both hands on the table and stared at the black wax. Nell passed the tube to Ruth. Ruth listened, then Thomas, then the sheriff and the stenographer. Each playing made the old voices slightly more fragile. When the last person finished, Elias raised the reproducer. Augusta said the envelope had contained Thomas's rail ticket. Abigail had written the words across it, but Augusta took it to the post office. She also gave the press foreman the key to the composing room and told him Thomas had gone home. She had been promised the newspaper. Ruth asked whether she received it. Augusta looked at her brother. Their father's trust gave Thomas the controlling shares at 30, exactly as Abigail had said. But Thomas went to Chicago and allowed Abigail to continue managing the Gazette. Later he gave Augusta a minority share. She had betrayed him for a security he would have provided without knowing the price. Thomas's face held no anger now. Anger might have been a form of intimacy. What remained was distance. He asked why Augusta had not told him after Abigail's first stroke. Augusta said confession had grown more expensive every year. At first it would have cost a wedding, then a marriage, then their mother's reputation, then the hospital wing, then the library, then the memory of a lifetime. She kept waiting for a year in which the truth would demand less. There was never such a year. Nell said the price had not diminished. Augusta had merely sent the bill to other people. Augusta nodded. She did not ask forgiveness. Instead, she turned to Ruth and said that in 1902, Abigail had recovered the cylinder from Gideon Wren's burned wagon. Augusta begged her to destroy it. Abigail refused. She said wax was safer than conscience because wax could break. For 7 years, the cylinder remained in the locked Gazette cabinet. On the night of her second stroke, Abigail made Augusta bring it to her room. She held it against her chest until morning but would not allow anyone to play it. After Abigail died, Augusta moved it to the box of memorial recording. She claimed she had done so by mistake. No one believed her. Perhaps, Ruth thought, Augusta had inherited her mother's divided desire to protect the lie and arrange its discovery. The sheriff sealed the 3 fresh cylinders and the damaged original. The stenographer collected his pages. Before leaving, he asked Nell whether she wished the record kept private. Nell looked at Ruth. Ruth told her the choice was hers. Nell asked what would happen to the memorial if the recording became public. Thomas said the library committee would probably cancel it. Abigail's portrait might come down. The Gazette would be attacked by rival papers. Donations bearing her name might be refused for a season. Augusta whispered that some widows depended on the fund. Nell considered this. Then she said the fund should remain. Sick people did not become less sick because the donor had been cruel. Books did not become less useful. But the memorial should not praise Abigail's moral courage without naming the lives her courage had injured. If Briar Glen wished to honor the whole woman, it could hear the whole voice. The court reconvened the next morning. The judge read the transcript in private. He ruled that Ruth's recorded performance could not be separated from the conversation that followed, that the Mercer estate had obtained the original through improper pressure, and that the living speakers or their direct heirs had an equal interest in its use. Because all parties now consented to a public playing, the court would not forbid one. Augusta surprised everyone by consenting. She resigned from the Gazette that afternoon. The Abigail Mercer Memorial took place 1 week later. The opera house filled before the doors officially opened. Extra chairs stood in the aisles. Reporters came from Des Moines, Davenport, and Chicago. The ladies of the library committee argued over whether Abigail's portrait should remain above the stage. Ruth suggested they leave it. She did not want an empty wall pretending the woman had never existed. The white cyclamen stood beneath the portrait. Ruth had raised each plant in the patched greenhouse. In the footlight heat, their petals lifted like small pale flames. Mrs. Peabody began the program without her usual confidence. She spoke of Abigail's work for the library and county hospital. She also said a town proved its character not by selecting an innocent past, but by accepting an honest one. The pastor offered a short prayer. Then Nell walked onto the stage. The headmistress had asked her to sing the festival hymn before the recording. Nell refused the school choir but accepted the song. She wore a plain ivory dress Ruth had sewn from fabric they could afford. At her throat was no brooch. She carried no mark of either family. Thomas sat at the piano. Ruth watched from the first row. They performed the same hymn captured in 1891. Nell's voice was lower than Ruth's had been, richer and steadier. Thomas followed her tempo rather than leading. Halfway through the second verse, Nell glanced at him. He did not smile. He simply remained with her. When the last note faded, the opera house was silent. Nell did not wait for applause. She told the audience her name was Eleanor Hale. Ruth Hale was her mother. Thomas Mercer was her father. Both had agreed that she could speak for herself. She said the recording they were about to hear did not explain an entire life. No cylinder could do that. It preserved one act of fear, one act of coercion, and one refusal to submit. It also preserved the beginning of 18 years in which other choices had been made. She asked the town not to turn Abigail into a story simple enough to enjoy. Then she stepped away from the horn. Elias played the transfers in sequence. The first cylinder offered the song in Ruth's young voice. The second carried Abigail's threat and Ruth's answer. The third revealed Augusta behind the canvas, frightened into helping her mother destroy a future. The sound was poor. Listeners leaned forward to catch it. Scratches swallowed several words, yet no one could mistake the voices. When the final groove ended, Augusta rose from her seat in the sidebox. She descended the narrow stairs and walked onto the stage. Ruth had not known she intended to speak. Augusta faced the audience that had received the Mercer version of events for most of her life. She said the younger voice was hers. She had carried the envelope. She had helped confine her brother. She had watched Ruth leave Briar Glen and had done nothing. Then she turned toward Nell. Augusta did not call her niece. She did not claim a relationship as if naming could repair neglect. She said only that Eleanor Hale had paid for Augusta's security before she was born, and no apology could return what had been taken. She asked that her own Gazette shares be placed in trust for the newspaper employees, not for Nell. Money should not be handed to an injured girl and called forgiveness. Thomas looked at Ruth. Ruth had said those words to him in the greenhouse. Augusta must have heard them through the town, or perhaps she had finally reached the same truth by another road. The audience remained quiet as Augusta left the stage. There was no applause. Ruth was grateful. The memorial ended without the usual procession of handshakes. People left in small groups, speaking softly. Some avoided Ruth, some touched her sleeve. Mrs. Drury embraced Nell and cried hard enough for several less demonstrative neighbors. The headmistress approached with an apology prepared. Nell listened. Then she said she would not return to the founder's recital, but she would finish the school year. The headmistress could prove her regret by ensuring the next girl with an inconvenient family did not have to audition twice for the same place. The woman agreed. Outside, snow had begun to fall. Thomas stood beneath the opera house awning while reporters waited. One asked if he intended to marry Ruth and legitimize his daughter. Ruth felt Nell stiffen. Thomas answered that neither Ruth's dignity nor Nell's existence waited upon a remedy he could bestow. Questions about marriage belonged to Ruth, and he had not earned the right to ask one. The answer appeared beneath Thomas's photograph the next day. Some readers admired it. Others called it evasive. Briar Glen debated whether a gentleman should marry the mother of his child, whether Ruth should accept, and whether Nell should take the Mercer name. Ruth read none of the columns. She was too busy. Spring orders arrived early. The memorial had made the greenhouse famous beyond the county. Women wrote from towns Ruth had never visited, requesting camellia cuttings and packets of violet seed. Several letters contained confessions from mothers who had hidden births, daughters who had discovered altered names, and wives who had spent years living beside questions no one permitted them to ask. Ruth answered only the orders. She could grow flowers. She could not become the keeper of every stranger's regret. Thomas delayed his return to Chicago. At first he stayed because of the court papers, then because the Gazette required a new editor, then because Nell had examinations. Ruth noticed the excuses changing and told him not to invent business when he meant love. He said love was precisely the word he no longer trusted himself to use without evidence. So he offered evidence in ordinary pieces. He repaired the greenhouse boiler without putting his name on it. Ruth paid for the parts. He took Nell walking on Sunday afternoons when she invited him, never when she did not. He learned that she hated oatmeal, loved riverboats, and became impatient with any song written in a key chosen to flatter sopranos. He attended the Baptist choir from the last pew. Once, Nell called him father by accident while asking for a wrench. Both of them pretended not to notice. 2 weeks later, she used the word deliberately. Thomas went outside and stood behind the coal shed until he could return with a steady face. Ruth saw him through the glass. She did not follow. Their daughter had the right to give him a name without Ruth supervising the gift. Augusta moved out of the Mercer house in May. She rented 2 rooms above a dressmaker's shop in Davenport and began work as a proofreader. Before leaving Briar Glen, she came to the greenhouse. Ruth nearly refused to see her. Nell was at school. Thomas was in Chicago for 3 days. The shop held only Ruth, Augusta, and the camellia, which had dropped its flower and begun 2 new shoots. Augusta brought no money and no heirloom. She carried a small envelope. Inside was the rail ticket Ruth had bought in 1891, folded across the middle. Abigail's words still crossed it in brown ink. "Do not follow me." Augusta said she had found it among Abigail's private papers after the hearing. She could not explain why it had been kept. Ruth could. Evidence of power had been Abigail's favorite possession. Augusta asked what Ruth would do with it. Ruth tore the ticket once, then again. She fed the pieces into the stove. The flame took Abigail's sentence first. Augusta watched until nothing remained. She said she did not expect forgiveness. Ruth told her that was fortunate. The cruelty in the answer gave Ruth no pleasure. But neither did she soften it to ease Augusta's departure. Forgiveness offered under pressure was only another envelope carried for someone else. Augusta nodded. At the door, she paused beside the camellia. She said their mother had loved that plant. Ruth answered that love had not prevented Abigail from nearly killing it through neglect. No, Augusta said, it had not. Then she left. Ruth never saw her again. They exchanged 3 letters over the next 7 years, each one brief. Augusta described her work and asked once whether the camellia lived. Ruth replied that it did. Nothing more was required. By summer, Thomas had to choose between Briar Glen and his Chicago company. He did not ask Ruth to choose for him. He arranged to spend 10 days of each month in Iowa and the rest at the factory. It was an awkward, expensive pattern. Trains were late. Meetings were missed. Nell sometimes waited at the station only to receive a telegram saying a washed-out bridge had delayed him until morning. Each delay reopened something old in Ruth. The first time, she paced the greenhouse until midnight, certain Thomas had discovered that fatherhood was less charming when it required timetables. The second time, she accused him before he had removed his wet coat. Thomas listened. Then he showed her the mud on his boots from walking 3 miles around the damaged track. Ruth was ashamed. He did not tell her the fear was unreasonable. Reason had little authority over wounds trained by repetition. He said only that next time he would send 2 telegrams. The next time he did. Trust did not return like sunlight through opened curtains. It arrived like the camellia, one hard bud after a decade of leaves. In August, Nell received an offer from the Chicago Musical College. The tuition was beyond Ruth's means. Thomas could pay it without sacrifice. The old struggle entered the greenhouse at once. Ruth feared that accepting would make Nell dependent on the Mercer name. Thomas feared that refusing would turn Ruth's pride into another form of control. Nell listened to both and grew furious. She said they were still behaving as if her life were the table on which they settled their past. Then she proposed her own terms. Thomas would lend the tuition, not give it. Nell would repay half through work at his recording laboratory during school holidays. Ruth would contribute what she had already saved for teacher training. The remaining half of Thomas's loan would be repaid not in cash, but in recorded books for the Briar Glen Library, made for patrons whose eyesight had failed. Thomas said it would take years. Nell said education did too. Ruth agreed. That autumn, Nell left on the Westbound Train. Ruth stood on the same platform where she had waited in 1891. The roof had been repaired. Electric bulbs now hung where smoky lamps once burned. Porters pushed carts through the crowd. Nothing in the station remembered her suffering, and for the first time, she was glad. Thomas carried Nell's trunk aboard. He would accompany her to Chicago, then return to Briar Glen the following week. Before boarding, Nell embraced Ruth. She said she was not leaving because Ruth had failed her. She was leaving because Ruth had raised her well enough to go. Ruth held on too long. Then she opened her arms. The train moved out beneath a trail of smoke. Nell leaned from the window until the porter made her draw back. Thomas stood behind her, one hand braced above the frame. Ruth watched until the last car disappeared. She did not collapse. She did not regret. She walked home through the early autumn light and opened the greenhouse for the afternoon trade. Thomas returned as promised. He did not come carrying a ring. He brought a new wax cylinder in a plain cardboard box. Nell had made it during her first laboratory lesson. On the label she had written, "For Mother, play all of it." Ruth set the cylinder on the old phonograph. Thomas turned the crank, then stepped away so she could listen first. Nell's voice filled the hearing tubes. She described her room, the noise of the elevated train, the stern piano instructor, and the factory women who had already taught her 3 things the college had not. She said Thomas worried too much and pretended not to. She said Chicago smelled of coal, lake water, and hot metal. At the end, she sang the first verse of the June hymn. Then came silence. Ruth waited. The cylinder continued turning. After several seconds, Nell's voice returned. She said she had left the space empty on purpose. Silence was not always a lie. Sometimes it was the room a person gave another before speaking again. Then she said she loved Ruth. The groove ended. Ruth removed the tubes. Thomas stood across the work table. He did not ask what Nell had said, though he had surely heard the recording in Chicago. Ruth passed in the tubes. He listened anyway. When he finished, evening had turned every pane above them gold. Thomas took a folded timetable from his pocket. His train east would leave in 2 hours. He asked whether Ruth wished him to return after his next 10 days in Chicago. The question was not about schedules. For years, Ruth had believed strength meant making every departure final before someone else could choose it. She had called that certainty. She saw now that it had often been fear wearing work clothes. She told Thomas to return, not because a recording had erased what happened, not because grief made them young, not because Nell required her parents to become a romance the town could approve. She told him to return because a life could be judged by more than the hour in which it broke. Thomas did not touch her. He said he would be there the following Thursday. Ruth warned him that if the bridge washed out, 1 telegram would not be enough. He almost smiled. 2, he promised. After he left for the station, Ruth carried Nell's cylinder to the camellia corner. The plant had set 3 buds. She placed the cylinder on the shelf beside it, not hidden in a cabinet, not locked in a box, but sheltered from heat and easy to reach. Outside, the factory whistle marked 6 o'clock. A trolley rang at Cedar Avenue. Somewhere across town, the presses of the Mercer Gazette began the evening edition under a new editor and a new line printed beneath the masthead. No silence shall be mistaken for consent. Ruth turned down the greenhouse lamps one by one. In the final light, the black cylinder did not look like evidence or punishment. It looked small enough to hold in one hand. That was all a voice required. Not a perfect machine, not an innocent past, only a groove that had not been smoothed away, and someone willing, at last, to listen until the end.